Throughout history, it's been a common belief that social events, be it war, prosperity, civil protest, or even the latest fad, dictate society's overall social mood. A strong economy, great leaders, an attractive stock market, and even fun pop cultural trends create a positive social mood. Conversely, a bad economy, inept leadership, an asthmatic stock market, and disturbing pop cultural trends create a negative, fearful social mood. At least, that is the presumed cause and effect relationship. But camouflaged by the small town of Gainesville, Georgia, there's a group of researchers who believe the exact opposite is true. The Socionomics Institute hypothesized that social mood determines the character of social events, not the other way around. So a positive, upbeat society creates a strong economy, makes leaders appear talented, generates the desire to buy stocks, and produces happy pop cultural trends, while a nervous, fearful society creates a recession, makes leaders appear inept, goes to war, and produces negative themes in popular culture. And if that isn't radical enough, this seeming paradox in cause and effect can be linked not only to facts of human psychology, but even to biological principles found in the natural world. The Institute believes that these social mood trends follow a discernible pattern, a pattern that involves repetition and thus a degree of predictability. A pattern that the Institute believes could prove to be history's hidden engine. For answers, we begin with R.N. Elliott, who pioneered this research in the 1930s and 1940s.
R.N. Elliott was a corporate accountant who specialized in financial restructuring. He was taken ill later in life, and during his recovery, took an interest in the stock market and began a detailed investigation.
Elliott identified an overall pattern to fundamental market movement. The pattern occurs over and over again in the markets. Soon he realized that if you can identify where you are in the pattern, then you can predict where prices are likely to go next. The basic pattern unfolds in 5 waves. The 3 waves in the direction of the main trend are labeled 1, 3, and 5, which are separated by 2 interruptions labeled 2 and 4. The essential form, then, is 5 waves of net movement in the direction of the one larger trend, followed by 3 waves of net movement against it, progressing in 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Elliott further observed that these patterns were the same regardless of scale, the smaller versions linked to form larger ones, and so on. Bob Prechter became involved with Elliott's wave principle in the 1970s.
I'd been investigating methods of market analysis for quite some time. I got curious about this obscure idea called the wave principle. I wanted to know if some guy had imposed his idea of a pattern onto the market, or was it really there? I started keeping my own hourly charts, and I was quite amazed to find that he indeed explained the patterns that were there. I saw them over and over again, every hour, every day, every week, every month. So I had to know more. And first thing I did was I contacted the Library of Congress, and they didn't have his works, but I finally found them on microfilm in the New York Public Library. So I had copies made, and I found a wealth of material, a complete, all-encompassing theory of the stock market that had been lost to academia and Wall Street practitioners for all those years.
Prechter became so intrigued by the wave principle that he soon republished Elliott's original books in a volume called R.N. Elliott's Masterworks. In the meantime, he contacted financier A.J. Frost.
Frost had been a colleague of Hamilton Bolton's, who, along with a very well-known financial analyst named Charles Collins, kept Elliott's theories alive throughout the 1950s and 60s. And Frost and I just hit it off great from the first minute, and we decided to get together, consolidate all of Elliott's ideas, and put them into one volume.
The book Elliott Wave Principle would become the definitive guide to discerning the market's forms. Elliott Wave Principle has sold over 100,000 copies and has been translated into a dozen languages.
We've had now too high an inflation rate for the last 10 years.
In 1978, as inflation accelerated and after the Dow fell to 780, there was widespread pessimism. Elliott Wave Principle made a bold forecast for the financial future. This chart shows the Dow up to 1978. This chart shows Frost and Prechter's forecast. They expected a great bull market into the 1980s. The forecast came true. The bull market charged ahead further than Frost and Prechter expected, but the advance stayed true to form. It was one of the most highly emotional times in US history, and the stock market was shut down. The night of the tragedy, Prechter released a chart forecasting the S&P Composite Index.
Well, remember that in September 2001, the S&P had already been falling for a year and a half. So by 9/11, it was just days away from finishing 5 waves down, which means it was days away from the start of a very big rally. And that's exactly what happened. Terrorism threw almost everyone off, but it had absolutely nothing to do with our outlook. I mean, there was no terrorism at the high in 2000. It was almost all good news, and that's when you were supposed to be selling. So, sure, waves can throw you off now and then, but if you try to follow the news, it will almost always make you do the wrong thing. The wave principle can also be used to forecast macroeconomic changes. To investigate this, I went back to the charts and I compared changes in social mood against the occurrence of economic expansions and recessions. And what I found was that changes in the economy do not precede and cause changes in social mood, which is what most people think. But in fact, it was the opposite. The social mood changes preceded changes in the economy.
As it turns out, the mathematics behind nature's most vibrant forms play an important role in the wave principle and socionomics. What Elliott described decades ago today are called fractals, which are irregularly shaped objects that are self-similar at different scales. This self-similarity reveals order in many natural objects that at first glance seem random.
A classic example of a fractal is a stalk of broccoli. The whole stalk is a similar version of the individual piece that grows on the top. If you break that off, you're left again with a similar version of the whole stalk. This relationship has proved to be universal in nature, as represented by mountain ranges, cloud formations, and the distributions of galaxies.
A common characteristic of fractal systems is branching. Trees, circulatory systems, and rivers, for example, all display branching fractal patterns.
There are lots of fractal systems within the body. In my work on the heart is actually full of fractals. The most famous example of it is the blood vessels coming into the heart. The coronary circulation is a pattern of a branching network of blood vessels that's typically fractal, where the branching structures look very similar at different scales.
Even snowflakes, known for their dissimilarity from each other, display a fractal pattern internally.
What R.N. Elliott discovered 40 years ahead of modern mathematicians is that the stock market is a fractal. Not only that, he said it's a specific fractal. That's one heck of an achievement for somebody without a computer.
The tiniest recorded change in stock prices is called the tick. Some ticks occur in less than a second.
This tick graph covers 3 minutes of trading of the Dow on October 6, 1997. You see here the typical 5-wave pattern of the wave principle.
If we change the scale of time, we still see the same pattern.
Next, we show an hourly in September 97. This is a daily in 1962. A weekly in 1974-75. A monthly from 1932 to 42. A yearly from 1929 to present. And finally, this is a decade-by-decade graph from 1700 to present. All of these graphs show the typical 5-wave pattern of the wave principle, in spite of the fact that they differ in time spans by over 30 million to 1. In other words, the first one was 3 minutes and the last is 300 years, and they show the same structure.
A fractal is not the only ubiquitous natural phenomenon whose essence is its form. Another is the spiral. The logarithmic spiral depicts growth and expansion in the universe. For example, if we look at the branching tendencies of a tree, we see that as time progresses, one spiral expands as the number of branches increases, and another spiral contracts as the circumference of branches decreases. Spirals are reflected in structures as diverse as seashells, pine cones, sunflowers, whirlpools, and hurricanes. And as with fractals, we can see spirals at many different scales, from the growth of an embryo to a galaxy. So how do these spirals connect to socionomics?
The idealized depiction of the stock market's progress can be seen as a spiral. The top of each successive wave of one higher degree serves as a touch point for the exponential expansion. And pretty soon it begins to look like the pattern of a hurricane or galaxy. Now, what are stock prices? They are humanity's valuation of its own productive capacity. So human progress and regress form one of nature's growth patterns.
Fractals and spirals reveal an underlying order within many structures that on the surface seem chaotic. Progress and growth seem to occur naturally by these forms. But there could be an even more intimate connection to nature. In the 13th century, a mathematician named Leonardo Fibonacci discovered an important number sequence.
It's a very simple sequence of numbers, starting with the number 1 twice. Each succeeding number in the sequence is the sum of the 2 preceding ones. So the sequence goes 1, 1, and 2, and 3, and 5, and so on. And for reasons that are pretty mysterious, this sequence of numbers seems to appear in a wide variety of places in the natural world.
R.N. Elliott observed that the fractal he called the wave principle was built according to the Fibonacci sequence of numbers, which is governed by a ratio called the golden mean, or phi. The ratio of any two conjugative numbers in this sequence approaches phi. That is an irrational number, which is approximately 0.618. If you look at the Elliott wave patterns, these patterns involve a certain number of waves called impulse waves and corrective waves. Each type of wave, when broken down into its components, reproduces the Fibonacci sequence as the degrees of subdivision increase.
The 5 waves of progress and 3 waves of regress is the essential form of markets. If there were no fluctuation, there would be no change. So you need at least 3 waves to get fluctuation. Therefore, the 5-3 pattern is the most efficient way of achieving both fluctuation and progress. Nature is efficient, and this pattern is no exception.
The importance of the Fibonacci sequence in nature, just like the importance of fractals and spirals, is its ability to create a robust and efficient method of growth. There's a wealth of biological, psychological, and sociological evidence that supports the connection.
For example, the Fibonacci sequence is in flower head arrangements. In this example, notice how from stem to tip it subdivides 1, 2, 3, and 5. In the human body, we find a Fibonacci branching pattern as well. 5 appendages encompassing legs, arms, and head. 3 subdivisions within the arms and legs. 5 subdivisions off the hands and feet, and 3 subdivisions in the fingers and toes.
Then we find the Fibonacci ratio in heart muscles, in bronchial tube branching, even in the electrical potential of neurons, and as Roger Penrose pointed out, even in the arrangement of the brain's microtubules.
The DNA molecule, the code for life, is made up of 2 intertwining spirals. We find the 0.618 ratio between the helix's width and cycle length.
The Fibonacci ratio may even regulate the way we think.
In the 1950s, psychologist George Kelly tested the judgments people make on a positive-negative scale. He assumed that in value-neutral situations, the average response would be 50-50, but he found that in fact, it's 62-38, consistently weighted towards the positive or optimistic side. Researchers have confirmed his findings in numerous studies.
For example, when you ask people to judge how dark a piece of gray paper is, the answers don't produce a bell curve as you might think. They bulge at the 62% point. If you ask subjects to sort objects into 2 piles or rate acquaintances' character traits, or make choices in situations of uncertainty, you get the same result.
This bias extends to collective behavior. Stock market analyst Robert Ray showed in the early 1930s that, on average, bear markets tended to relate to bull markets by the Fibonacci ratio in both time and price, and recent studies show the same tendency in voting patterns.
It's easy enough to imagine that, or make claims, well, this Fibonacci sequence and the way that it appears in very many areas of life is just like some kind of number mysticism. It's equally easy to take the position to say, look, when the same thing keeps occurring in such a wide spectrum of areas, there has to be some underlying reason for it. I tend to the latter point of view.
The robustness, resilience, and efficiency of all these universal forms, spirals, fractals, and Fibonacci relationships, may be connected to collective social mood. Nature prefers the most efficient path. In the case of the wave principle, though, the efficiency is not in the individual's biology, but the efficiency in the progress of the species.
The idea that fractal patterns, spirals, and Fibonacci growth all exist in the stock market is certainly remarkable. But then when you consider that the stock market itself is a measure of humanity's productive capacity, and then when you consider that cultural trends ebb and flow with that pattern, I mean, the resulting implications are quite grand, really.
Frost and Prechter stated in Elliott wave principle that the same law that shapes living creatures and galaxies is inherent in the mentation and activities of human societies.
The wave principle reveals that the human social experience derives from the tension between the opposing forces of progress and regress. Its ruling ratio is phi, the same ratio that rules branching fractals and spirals in nature. So this is one of nature's fundamental arrangements.
But there is still one key element to explore. That is, an understanding of why human interaction accommodates the wave principle.
The wave principle says markets are pattern. Well, whatever causes that pattern to be so very well defined in form is probably also pattern.
But why were they patterned? Why do people buy and sell stocks? Why do they listen to certain music? Why do they do all of the things that make these patterns apparent? To answer these questions, Prechter gathered the latest studies on the psychological aspects of human social behavior. And what he found was that scientists had been increasingly describing an unconscious impulse in humans that is commonly associated only with lower animals: herding.
The herding theory is a very important concept within the psychology of investing. I see much evidence that it's true, going back to the idea of why do people behave in a crowd all together rather than thinking independently. People have a sense of belonging when they're in the herd. It's much more comfortable to go with the crowd than it is to take a contrarian or independent point of view. So from an emotional standpoint, if you buy the stock that everybody else is saying is great, you're going to be comfortable, especially when it's going up. To make a more independent decision is going to cause you some anxiety.
There's a column called Herd in the Street, H-E-A-R-D, and professionals often refer to it as herd, H-E-R-D, because we in the business know that that's the way we act at times.
We also follow the experts on the stock market, even though good research has shown that the experts are really wrong most of the time.
There have been studies, very profound studies, checking, for example, the independence versus dependence between analysts. They are very much saying the same thing. They are always calling friends, colleagues, okay, what do you think about this? Trying to take the temperature of the feelings. And so this means clearly that the decision that a stockbroker or an investor is making on the market is not, an isolated fact. It's linked with the decision with the other.
Why do we have a herding impulse? Research has shown that herding could be an instinctual process governed by the primitive areas of our brains. Dr. Paul MacLean's triune brain theory hypothesizes three separate parts to our brain. Paul Montgomery was the first market analyst to link a theory of the segmented human mind to pattern group behavior.
The triune concept suggests that the human forebrain is best understood as consisting of a hierarchy of three fundamentally distinct brain systems. Now, these three neural systems, the reticular or reptilian complex, the limbic system, and the neocortex, are all radically different one from the other, both in form and function. Nevertheless, the three are also highly interrelated. Now, this being the case, it appears that much human behavior can be explained only as a product of three radically different minds: our primal mind, our emotional mind, and our rational mind.
One part of the brain is the spinal cord, the midbrain, and the cerebellum, which is the primitive brain and the seat of most of the functions that have to do with basic life. For example, breathing resides there.
That part of the brain controls herding behavior, flocking behavior, schooling behavior in fish.
The limbic system is the part of the brain that contains emotions and does connect us to some lower animals and includes structures such as the thalamus and the amygdala and the hippocampus.
The thinking done by the primitive brainstem and the limbic system is not irrational, it's pre-rational, primitive, aimed at survival in a primeval setting. Fleeing, fighting, acquiring, herding, these are all unconscious impulses aimed at survival. Now, what's more is that several scientific studies show that the limbic system is faster than the neocortex. It also regulates the amplitude of emotions so that an intense emotion can drown out rational thought.
We can see from an evolutionary standpoint why that's a desirable thing, because there are times when somebody doesn't need to stop and think about the danger, but instead to immediately act or react.
It's also disassociated from time, so whatever that part of the brain wants, it wants now.
But from an investment standpoint, the limbic system is not helpful.
It's clear that emotional factors in the stock market play a major role, and that the development of the brain is such that the connections between the cortex and the limbic system is to a certain extent disconnected, and that at moments of panic and moments of fear, that the limbic system takes over, and it's those things that determine the decisions at that time. Therefore, when people panic in the stock market, they're making their decisions primarily on an emotional level, not on the kind of rational level that we would think.
But on October 29, Black Tuesday, the bottom dropped out.
Some believe that the herding patterns of investors on Wall Street lead to financial crashes.
There is a collective behavior, people not knowing it, but do things that leads to a global behavior of the stock market, which is cooperative. One of the consequences of the cooperative phenomenon is the creation of a critical point. What is a critical point? It is when the order is so dominating that suddenly people are doing all the same thing, which is exactly what happens in stock market crashes, because everybody wants to sell at the same time, while in normal times, there are half the number of people who wants to sell, and the other half wants to buy, and most of the people wants to do nothing, of course, but there is a very good balance.
It's easy, even for conventional economists, to go along with the idea that stock market panics are emotional and impulsive, but what I can't get them to see is that the upside is no different. Sure, herding animals panic occasionally, but much of the time they're just quietly grazing, but they're still herding, and that's the key to why humans keep forming Elliott wave patterns. They're getting their cues from each other all the time.
I wish to reaffirm America's commitment to the Atlantic Alliance.
If we accept the wave principle, then we must concede that society, through government for example, cannot control or direct the social mood or the economy or even its own proclivity for peace or war. This conclusion seems hard for many people to accept.
Some people react to the wave principle with mild annoyance because it challenges the idea that human directors, such as politicians or central bankers, can control collective behavior and our social future.
I'm also not trying to pull the party to the left or the right or leave it alone. I'm trying to push it into a new future, which I think is what all the American people want.
We want to shut down government in general, full stop.
I don't think any person or agency can change social mood trends, But as an individual, you can act on your conclusions, and in the most extreme circumstances, you can harness the crowd to your benefit in a big bull market, for example, or get out of harm's way in a big social mood decline. To put it succinctly, it can make you rich or save your life.
Dr. Wayne Parker is director of the newly formed Socionomics Foundation.
The standard social science model treats man as a completely rational being, almost like a calculating machine, responding to external events with rational decisions, always in its own best interest. But we socionomists see man as a fundamentally rational and non-rational creature, acting both consciously and unconsciously. So in our view, it's really more useful to view man as an evolved biological organism with complex motivations, rather than simply as a passive reactor to external forces.
The wave principle describes a hidden engine of social experience that's both necessary and good, whether we like its current expression or not. The point is that living systems require setbacks to flourish. Now, the wave principle assures us that the setbacks are temporary and that the long-term trend of human progress is upward. I think that's a comforting message.